Welcome back to another episode of the CE podcast here. It is good to be back after somewhat of, I'll say, a little bit of a forced hiatus due to a lot of the monetization and funding issues that we had been having as a company over the last 5 years. But things are beginning to really change and move back in a good direction. So it's exciting to be back. And thank you to all of those who continue to support our work and help keep this going. I feel like the conversations and the stuff that we've been talking about for so many years are now huge in the forefront of what's going on. And it's just time. It's time to have these types of conversations. And with that said, I'm actually going to be doing a bit of a series on this podcast over the next, let's say, 5 or 6 episodes. And this episode here with Daniel Pinchbeck is part of that series. And in these episodes, what I want to do is explore somewhat of a theme of our current moment. Really begin to sort of ask these questions of what exactly is going on in our current moment from a different lens, from a different way of looking at things, sort of coming out of the weeds of all of the facts and distractions that are happening on the ground, but taking a bigger picture look at what's happening and really ask this question of how can we make progress? How can we move forward? Even given the fact that it's going to be very difficult for many of us to agree on all of the exact same things, right? Because we seem to be at a time, and we can see this everywhere. I'm shocked as I look at this every day on social media, where, let's say in the United States, for example, a portion of the population believes that we're in this almost apocalyptic end of America type moment. And another portion kind of feels like it's the golden era of political change, of things finally coming to the surface. And, who's right in all of this? Well, personally, I tend to think we're seeing a little bit of a mix of both, that there is sort of a different way we have to look at what's happening to truly understand what's going on. And this has been part of what CE has been doing since 2009, is kind of proposing that the old ways of looking at our world, trying to make sense of it and trying to understand it through these limited frameworks of how we look at our political situations and what's happening, just don't work anymore. Right? And we kind of need to bring a new perspective, a new almost sense of wisdom to the table to kind of understand more about what is driving our current collective and moment of human consciousness. So in these conversations, ultimately, you're going to see that there is going to be people sharing things that I don't generally agree with, but that's the point. That's the point of these conversations, is that I want to be able to kind of model something where, hey, we don't have to agree on every single detail, right? We don't have to listen to podcasts or watch videos that are stuck in some sort of echo chamber view of what's happening, but that we can come together and kind of agree on enough things to say, what type of world do we really want to create? Where do we want to go from here? How do we make progress together as a society without getting caught up in fighting over the small, tiny details? So that's really going to be the goal of this series here. So if this sounds interesting to you, by all means, take the time to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform where you get podcasts. Of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. You can also join our email list where we will release new podcasts amongst other content and different pieces of information we put out. And you can do that at the link in the description somewhere, or by visiting collective-evolution.com/CE-insight. So today I'm going to be having a conversation with Daniel Pinchbeck. He is an author, a philosopher, and a futurist, and he focuses on anything from exploring the depths of human consciousness to analyzing our current events from a broader lens. This conversation will focus on all of the key themes of this series that I intend on doing to explore what it means to truly make progress in our current moment, given our current geopolitical landscape that seems to be chaotic, to say the least. So with that said, let's dive in. All right, well, Daniel, it's been a long time since you and I got to connect like this. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you too, Joe.
Yeah. So obviously there's a lot going on in the world, and a lot of things to be concerned about, a lot of things to wonder if we're moving in a good direction, and that's going to be a topic of discussion here. But I kind of wanted to start specifically kind of around this idea of consciousness and worldview. And I wanted to start here from the standpoint to get your take on the way you see, I guess, humanity's and even individual collective consciousness, like how our consciousness impacts the way we see the world, the way we make decisions, and the way we act. How is it, what relationship do you see there in everything that you look at between our consciousness and how we think and feel and how we act within society, how we create society?
Oh, that's a very big question. I'm for reasons that I can then go into, I'm very partial to, I guess the Buddha said, is it, why am I not? As perceived, so appears, I guess. Mm-hmm. Like our perception kind of has some, shapes our reality. So like where we're at in our understanding or belief is somehow, shapes everything, conceptually. So like, for me, a big thing is, we're coming out of a period of the last few centuries of scientific materialism, atheism, reductive materialism. Personally, I feel that that's become a little bit of an obsolete worldview, even though most people haven't realized it yet. Basically due to the impacts of like quantum physics, like 2022, the Nobel Prize for Physics went to the discovery that the universe is actually not locally real. So there isn't like really like a fixed thing there. It's like when we are perceiving the the wavicles appear as particles, like we temporarily fix them with our capacity to observe, but otherwise the universe is kind of in flux,
Yeah.
And so this idea has been elaborated upon and formalized by a philosophy called monistic or analytic idealism. Bernardo Kastrup is one of the main proponents of this idea right now, although there's a number of other ones like Donald Hoffman, Amit Goswami, then going back earlier, somebody like Rudolf Steiner, they all identified as monistic or analytic idealists. So, and really it's the same thing that Eastern metaphysics like Buddhism or Vedanta talks about, which is essentially that, consciousness, not matter, is the foundational layer of reality, or like the ontological primary. And everything that we experience is actually within consciousness. Like consciousness is actually the sort of the horizon. And so it's like a toggle shift from thinking that consciousness just arises accidentally from physical processes over millions and billions of years. It's actually that it's more like consciousness has a certain level of like, even if it's maybe instinctive or whatever, it seems to have a certain level of intentionality in that it wants to kind of know itself and it wants to discover itself. And therefore, kind of in an anti-evolutionary or anti-entropic way, that instinctive consciousness seeks to create more and more complex containers for individual subjective experience. So that, it can play, basically, discover itself, discover its creative ability. So in a sense, rather than the universe being, defined by the sort of blind evolutionary push where, we had opposable thumbs, then consciousness kind of emerged, we developed language and so on. It's actually that it's like a pull where we're actually, we're here in this form because of this kind of investigation of consciousness into its own nature. This is very much what I take from, what used to be like, lots and lots of psychedelic explorations. My first book, Breaking Open the Head, was on psychedelic shamanism, 5-MeO-DMT, ayahuasca, LSD, mushrooms, ketamine, all that stuff. Plus intellectual studies of, everyone from Carl Jung to Walter Benjamin to Dzogchen to Eastern metaphysics, yada, yada. So I tend to believe that as a civilization, although most people don't realize it yet, we're actually on the cusp of a shift from the reductive materialist or physicalist worldview to this monistic idealist or analytic idealist worldview. And that actually is very profound because the scientific materialism, tends to lead to a kind of nihilism where if you really believe that consciousness is only a product of the physical brain, then you assume that when you die, that's the extinction, annihilation of any subjectivity or experience. So that type of belief engenders consumerism and materialism because the best you can do given that, is to, buy stuff, try to like amass, things to make yourself comfortable in the present moment, satisfy your instinctive drives and so on. Whereas like if you look at Eastern cultures that have a knowledge, let's say, of karma and reincarnation, they're not so focused on, having the Jeff Bezos yacht, or the Zuckerberg Hawaiian, bunker. It's more like, you're in a big cycle of karma, incarnation after incarnation, and this is just a small piece of that huge puzzle, and you just want to be the best you that you can be, the most generous, the most kind, the most caring, in this circumstance, in a way. That's part of the great cosmic dream, So I think if we, engineer a shift out of materialism to idealism, a lot of things would change with that. The priorities of our civilization would change, from the focus on material acquisition, or monetary acquisition, let's say, to exploration of the different dimensions of consciousness, mind-body states. What are the potentialities within consciousness? And then we would start to look more seriously at extraordinary state experiences. Whether it's like the Tibetan lamas who reach the state of what's it called, tuktam, where their bodies actually remain. Even though they're dead, their bodies don't decay for like several weeks, for like a month or so after death. They remain in the lotus position and so on. And it's understood in that tradition that even though there's no vital signs, no heartbeat, no anything, they're actually still holding themselves in a subtle state of consciousness, in a meditative state. And in that state, they're able to choose their future incarnation or explore nirvana in different respects. So, I think we don't even know what's possible. And one of my, I guess I'm sorry, I went on at length. I don't know why. I just had some coffee. I guess from this kind of idea to what's happening, in the world with artificial intelligence and, this idea that we're going to lock ourselves into kind of a digital binary reality, I'm very suspicious of that, because I think we don't really understand who we are yet, or what the potentials are within an organic consciousness. Yeah. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, 100%. And I definitely agree with a lot of the things you were saying there. And I have been fascinated with these questions for a long time. And the reason why I like to start with this bigger question is it sort of sets the framework and foundation worldview of kind of like where we can then dive deeper into how we take these concepts of the way we see what you might say are like the deepest layers of our reality, and then say, how do we bring that into the physical world where we kind of live and breathe every day? And like, how do we apply these philosophies to everyday life, especially when we look at what's going on in society? And so when I hear what you've laid out, you've laid out this idea of this shift in consciousness, this shift in the way that we fundamentally understand reality, ourselves, relationship, all this stuff. And in a sense, I wanted to double click on one of the things you said, where you mentioned play. It's almost like we're in this game where consciousness is sort of creating aspects of itself to come and play, in a sense. And I'm curious, like, if you could expand upon that idea of like what you see happening as play. Like, it's very easy, and this is the context I'd like you to loop in. It's very easy to feel like this game we're playing is so intensely serious and scary, but at the same time, there's this understanding of play and an understanding of the cosmic dream. And I'd love you to tie those ideas together and maybe create a little bit of a frame of how we might integrate that deeper understanding into how we live everyday life in this moment.
Okay, I can try. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like I'm a big believer in like certain aspects of like tantric philosophy, like this idea that samsara is nirvana. So at the one and the same time, and this is something I think that like, I don't know, 5-MeO-DMT or Bufo, when you smoke that, it's not NN-DMT, it's the other form, which leads to like a really profound like dissolution of ego and kind of sort of you sense like you're in these like infinite lattices of geometries, kind of like Islamic patterning, but there's no boundary or end to them. And it's not like you're separate from them. It's like at the peak of the experience, there is no separation. It's just this sort of, bodiless bliss that goes on for eternity. So samsara is nirvana. even though we're experiencing the relative world of illusion and delusion and physicalism and so on, that's like, it's like an ocean that creates like a little like bubble or foam. Really doesn't change the consistency of the ocean. It's all made of water. Just the water takes different forms at different times. But the underlying ocean is still that nirvana, bliss, non-detachment, and so on. And so we're just playing in the foam, in the waves in that sense. And that's just So I mean, you could look at things as very serious, or you could look at things as very playful. I mean, very lighthearted. I mean, it does feel that while we're here, we have responsibilities like to ourselves and the people around us, maybe the world as a whole, and nature, that maybe we haven't been fulfilling very well. As we've made this like rapid movement towards material technologies and sort of imperialism and so on. What else can I tell you?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I'm trying to sort of set a context here of like, sometimes people who study a lot of this stuff, and I've seen this a lot in maybe more of the New Age circles, where they can get stuck per se, and this is like my own words I'm putting, where it's like they can get stuck in perceiving that, oh, everything just is what it is, and we shouldn't worry about what's happening. Like almost like we shouldn't try to steward, we shouldn't try to take responsibility, we shouldn't sort of be engaged in what's occurring on the material form, because it's all just perfect and it's going in its own evolution. So I wanted to bring this up to just try and again see like you're of the perspective where you have this feeling that yes, this is an ultimate truth, but in the experience, the human experience, we're meant to steward, we're meant to respond, we're meant to engage. Am I correct in all that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think also kind of it's interesting when a lot of people in the sort of post New Age, spiritual worlds, they go back to, Eastern metaphysics, and then we have kind of like Christianity, which in some ways is gaining steam right now. Like even some sort of like progressive intellectuals or radical thinkers are going back to Christianity, but there's still a big disconnect where people look at Christianity as like something to reject or stupid or whatever. But yeah, it feels like Christ was very much about, it's like life itself is like the practice or the initiation. It's like, and so that's something that, I've really tried to hammer home, as a different idea. I don't even know if I've lived up to it myself, effectively, but that idea that, it's fine to have like to meditate on a cushion and have all these great ideas, but, to bring that, more intensified consciousness and make beautiful things out of it in the world, and create like a more caring world or whatever. More is that's kind of like the goal. Mm-hmm. I think it easily becomes like a bypass when people just stay on the meditation cushion forever, or feel that they're like too good for the worldly thing. But that's actually the initiation, is when you bring it back, that's kind of my thinking.
Beautiful. Yeah, agreed. And so with that kind of as like a frame in a sense, this question of like, and this is kind of the tough part. I mean, I know you're doing this work a very long time. I'm like my 16th year of being engaged in thinking about things from the standpoint of a shift in consciousness and looking at what's going on. And, one of the questions is always like, how do we understand if we're making progress in a lot of these things, in a lot of what's happening? And it's a very, very tricky question, because you can look at it from things that are sort of occurring from like a shift in the way humans are thinking about things, are open to new things, but we can also look on the ground and see politically and, let's say from a social point of view, we can look there more materially and say what's happening there. And so with this question of progress, like how would you define, or how would you notice if we are making progress as a species towards a more, let's say, connected, a more conscious, a more beautiful world, whatever it is, however you might define that?
Well, this was like a big part of my work years ago. I wrote a book called 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, which is, we just republished it as Quetzalcoatl Returns. And I was looking at the Mayan calendar and the Hopi prophecies and, even like Judeo-Christian ideas around the apocalypse and Revelation, and kind of correlating them with events that are happening in our time. And yeah, I got very interested in like Gene Gebser, a philosopher, who talks about these different consciousness structures. That came out in 2006, 7. Then 2012 came. I'd never predicted that everyone was going to like get enlightened or whatever, but there was a little bit of a hangover of disappointment about kind of everything sort of seems stuck in the same way before as it was before. At this point, I guess I'm less sure that I mean, also part of our problem is that we're short-term beings. Unless we create life extension, we're here for like 70, 80 years. So we look at things through our limited time frame. We're like, oh, like, is evolution happening? Is this transformation happening? And it could be that these are larger cycles, and we can only perceive like a little piece of the puzzle. I mean, definitely which my first book had something to do with kind of like the rediscovery of psychedelics, and then kind of like in shamanic cultures, indigenous practices, then like the ongoing effort to kind of take what's good from that and integrate it into the Western world. I mean, that's very interesting. The development of esoteric ideas around the world, and then through the internet, we can see how they relate, whether it's occultism or Sufism or Kabbalah. So that, there's a lot of things that are positive in that sense. But yeah, there's also some things that are very disappointing and very negative. Like, I didn't think that we were going to have to like refight for like racial justice so much, and abortion rights, and things that seem kind of settled now, are very unsettled again. And that's interesting too. And there's lots of reasons why that's happening or whatever. But so it seems like in some ways also the impacts of social media have been problematic, in that in some ways maybe they've actually lessened people's capacity to feel or to react or to respond effectively. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not as clear. That it felt very much like we were on this evolutionary current when I wrote my first books, and then I saw the psychedelic movement happen. I was very fascinated by transformational festivals and Burning Man. Then I feel a lot of that stuff got co-opted back into a more like exploitative, capitalist kind of thing, which isn't my thing so much. And now we're obviously seeing Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and sort of like the shift in America, which is threatening the whole world and so on. But I hold out hope that. Sometimes you have like a baby, being born, or you have contractions and expansions. Yeah. So maybe this is actually like a big contraction, that then leads to a bigger expansion.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fascinating question because, you mentioned so many different things that kind of brought back memories of just paying attention to all this stuff over the years, from seeing kind of the early days of, people being really interested in consciousness and spirituality and transformation on the internet, right? Because these subjects were always big in books and different things, but when you can connect almost instantaneously and see these trends and these ideas build on the internet, it's fascinating. But to your point, they quickly became identities that people held, and they became exploitative, and there's a whole industry around it. And it kind of, that old world paradigm sort of took it over. I think I've seen that happen a lot with independent media too, where it feels like independent and alternative media is kind of conservative opportunists that have kind of taken over most of it now. And it's just such a different feel than it was, 7, 8 years ago and beyond. So there's this element of, I always think about the progress question, because like you said, we're short-term beings, but also we can be almost like micro-term beings in the sense where it's like day to day, it can be so easy to get caught up in whatever is happening in that moment. And it's difficult to understand, are we making progress? And I kind of want to tease this question apart a little bit more too, because it's like this idea you brought up at the end, this idea of the contractions, right? So this contraction of birth, I've always kind of observed that the more chaos that happens, the more people seem to ask questions. The more people seem to pay attention. And we may not land on the same answers together, but we're questioning. And so I'm curious, like, even when you look at COVID, for example, and it felt as though millions more people started to question the ways in which it was handled, the ways in which power and authority might be enacting. Do you see that as a sign of progress, even if maybe we didn't all come to the same conclusions together?
Interesting. I'm not sure. I mean, I feel that there's a lot of regress there too. So I feel like one problem we're having right now, as a result of the evolution of social media and social technology, is, and there were reasons that we'd sort of lost faith in our experts and we lost trust in our establishment, but we still had some faith in experts. Like if somebody studied microbiology for 10 years, you would assume that they know more about it than a lawyer who pursues, anti-vax cases or something. Somehow, I think, some things happen as a result of social media. Everybody had a voice, which is cool. Also, where it was once very easy to tell kind of the stylistic differentials between like the sort of establishment gatekeepers of knowledge, and more like, trashy stuff, as you have like spell checkers and grammar checkers and the ability to make, nice looking websites and so on. It became harder and harder to really discern, or video, same thing. Alex Jones's, InfoWars looks, more or less as professional as, Morning Joe or whatever. So at a certain point, like a lot of our ways of kind of establishing kind of like, hierarchies of expertise began to disintegrate. And we also have a culture that kind of like insists that, everybody's opinion or ideas of equal value. We're a democracy, we're a little bit anti-intellectual. I mean, maybe, I don't know how different it is in Canada. But I think, unfortunately, that step by step has brought us to more and more difficult ground.
Yeah.
And particularly, when you have topics that are extremely ambiguous and murky, where there might actually not be a right answer. And everybody is just doing their best, including the experts that you're counting on. And I think, in the case of COVID, one of the very big mistakes made by the sort of expertise community was to sort of circle the wagons and not to be like, well, guys, like we're actually not sure here. Like we don't, we don't know what the origin of this thing was yet. And, we think that these vaccines, are probably our best shot at controlling this. And we think that masks, are our best shot. But, anyway, there's a lot you could go through, but obviously this has become a big contributor to the whole, what I would say is a complete catastrophe with a sort of neo-authoritarian takeover of the U.S. right now. But people became so confused and, began to just trust their gut or their instinct and like, oh, I resonate with this. And then as we know from the Cambridge Analytical story and the movie The Social Network, kind of the filter bubble effect happened.
Yep.
So if you have like a feeling about something, you're liking certain types of content, you get more and more of that. So your opinions or your, maybe they become prejudices, then your prejudices become beliefs, and the beliefs become like a new ideology, and more stuff is feeding into that ideology. And before you know it, you don't even know how you got there, but you're locked in to a set of beliefs and assumptions that really are maybe not, logically justified. So I feel that happened, and there are a lot of different reasons that happened, but it's led us to a very like a dark abyss at the moment,
Yeah, there's lots to potentially unpack here. There's a word that's coming to mind that I want to throw out, and it's adversarial. And what I feel, and you pointed out something that I certainly agree with, is that there is good reason at times to not trust our experts and some of the ways in which governing works. But sometimes it can go all the way to the other side, and it can become like totally down the rabbit hole, ungrounded. We don't even know what is true anymore, and it just becomes anything that anybody says is now true because it's alternative to the mainstream position. And that's obviously a problem, and there's a lack of wisdom there. But it feels as though, I say adversarial because it's like we get into these modes where we're always battling the sides. Like one side's always battling the other side, and we're very rarely synthesizing. We're very rarely trying to come together and say, how do we take what it is that you see and feel and what I see and feel, and kind of see where we can land and move forward. Instead, where I'm staunch in my position, you're staunch in your position, and we're fighting, right? And I wonder if, when we think about the early parts of this conversation, when you were mentioning sort of the consciousness and worldview, and we were looking at the interconnected nature of what the new paradigm is showing versus the sort of materialistic, separatist, and almost nihilistic point of view, I wonder if, because that nihilistic, like separate point of view is such a large part of what has informed our society for so long, that this adversarial nature through which we go about this breakdown of trust, this breakdown of the existing consensus, because it's being done through an adversarial worldview, it's hard for us to guide it with wisdom. Whereas if we had this more interconnected consciousness worldview, a breakdown of old ideas may be guided with much more wisdom. I'm curious what you think of that idea.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree. I mean, I think, unfortunately, social media evolved within a corporate, profit-driven kind of ethos, and I think that years ago I tried to build a social network called Evolver, where we never had the funding that we needed to put the ideas into practice, but. And we wanted to try things like a network where everybody controlled their own data and the monetization of their data. This was back in like 2006, 2007. So we were already aware that was going to become a huge problem, that actually individuals needed to have a sacrosanct holder of their data and their information. Then they could choose what parts of themselves they shared, instead of what we ended up with is a very predatory or parasitic system where everybody's data is mined and you don't have any control over it. But similarly, in terms of an information ecosystem, places like Facebook and so on, Twitter, they kind of thrive on outrage and anger, because that is it's like the limbic brain reacts, and that massively increases kind of engagement.
Yes.
Where if you're trying to be more synthesizing and harmonic and like fair to all sides, you tend to be sort of muted. And people don't really pay as and I see this all the time in my own work. Like if I write about an essay where I'm like attacking somebody or going after somebody or whatever, or saying everything is terrible, I'll easily get a lot more engagement.
Yes.
But if I try to say like, actually this thing is pretty good and these guys are kind of cool and I'm like into like the way this thing is happening, there's much less interest. So it's like we're looking for the constant like dopamine hit. And somehow that often comes through, kind of outrage or, and so you can just see the way that over the number of years, the way a lot of people communicate has been twisted around, where they're so angry, they're like, ready to pounce on everything, and that's, and that reactivity has supported, a kind of reactionary political ideology, where you're not really thinking about like long-term consequences. Like, okay, like why are, all these, black people from Ghana and the Ivory Coast turning up on my street right now looking for food? Is that like, are they just bad people? They just somehow managed to, steal into the country? Or maybe the US like did some stuff and Europe like created some bad situations through corporate, capture and exploitation and took away a lot of their livelihoods, and then they had to try to figure out something else because they can't support their family. You know what I mean? It's like, we're the sort of the development of an outrage based reactive culture has sort of led to and that also with the short bites of like social media just led to a more and more reactive, like less people thinking in longer contexts and historical contexts, and has fed into the sort of Trump, MAGA, Musk kind of thing. In a way.
Yeah, it's like we don't have a sort of an appetite or a capacity for complexity, and instead we're kind of just running by the seat of what I would, from my nervous system background, I would say we're actually just operating off of consistent survival, which is, kind of where that limbic brain becomes so sensitive to everything. There's no capacity to look at something we disagree with and actually be curious about it as a natural reaction. Instead, we just react. And so kind of the question I'm digging at here too is also like, do you see this reactionary stuff that's happening within humanity and the ways in which social media is preying on people? Is it preying on our nature in a sense, or do you believe it's preying on our conditioning in a way?
Well, I guess both. I mean, I think we're biologically predisposed to scan for threats, the environment. Like in a sense, the brain is really an outgrowth of the immune system. The immune system, is designed to deal with like microbial or like microscopic threats or things coming through the food. Then our brains develop to deal with like the tiger that's coming at us, or the barbarians that are about to storm, the village or whatever. So that that our tendency is to always be on high alert, and we can channel that high alert, into creative activity, into metaphysical, exploration and so on. But unfortunately, our natural propensity has been very much exploited within this whole domain of cognitive capitalism for the profit-seeking companies to maximize their shareholder value and stuff.
Yeah, because I mean, as beings with these higher order brains, where we can, like for example, what you're pointing out about the tiger and being on high alert for the tiger, we would recognize that as a legit threat to life. Yet we're seeing a social media post as a threat to life, and I think the issue is that the higher order thinking is not recognizing the difference, right? So it's almost like we're seeing the social media post as a tiger, when in fact, if we thought about it, it shouldn't be bringing about the same degree of survival alarm bells. And so for me, I see this as like, we're part of the issue that we have is we've become so oriented in our survival as a baseline, and we're losing that capacity to use our higher order thinking to not succumb. So it's almost like there's such a lack of consciousness collectively of the way we are being, let's say, invited all the time into this very reactionary state. And I think that with consciousness, we have the ability to sort of not be taken into that survival mode so much. And I feel I'm tying this into something you said earlier, where you said we sort of need to engineer a shift in consciousness. And I'm curious if you were, with what we've been talking about here, like, how do you see that idea of culturally engineering a shift? Like, how might we go about doing that? Like, what would have to happen?
Well, you're really going for the big questions, Joe. I like it. Not the small stuff right now.
This is what matters.
Well, I mean, a bunch of my, writing and life's work have been directly trying to, work on that project. I mean, my first book in 2002 was on psychedelic shamanism, and that for me, that was like, oh ho, like here's actually something that really can transform consciousness. And when I wrote that book and published it, and I went to Africa to do iboga, I was in the Amazon with ayahuasca, I was in the Mazatec Indians in Oaxaca where we found mushrooms. And I also wrote about like the Burning Man Festival. I interviewed like Sasha Shulgin, where we, who discovered all these psychedelic compounds in the 60s and so on. And it's sort of like they'd also had that hope in the 60s that the psychedelic awakening would lead to profound systems change. I mean, in a way like Leary, when he went ballistic on tune in, turn out, and tune on and drop out, that was right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we had the sense that our future was very precarious, and that there was a lack of consciousness that was leading us to just give in to this like war machine and all this stuff. But unfortunately, so we've had the second psychedelic renaissance, which has been very science-based, very mental health-based, also very entrepreneurial-driven. This idea that microdosing psychedelics can optimize or lead to creative breakthroughs for business or innovation or whatever.
Yeah.
I feel there were sort of problems with that. It was kind of assimilating or unfolding psychedelics back into the sort of capitalist exploitation paradigm in a way. But it has had ripple effects, and now a lot more people are exploring psychedelics in the West, and people from different cultures. They've decriminalized it. There's billion-dollar companies and so on. So that I pat myself on the back a little bit for contributing maybe to one era of consciousness change.
Yeah.
I also started a media company and a social network and a nonprofit, which had local groups. And there it was really a more like full spectrum attempt to try to like engineer a evolution of consciousness. The project was called Evolver. We had like 60 local groups at the peak. We had our own media platform. Then we also had a social network where we were really trying to cultivate voices from the community. And and so then the idea was to create like a new paradigm that included like local currencies, permaculture, consciousness exploration, shamanism, non-traditional relationship patterns, tantra, ecstatic dance, and so on. But we sort of ran out of financial runway before we could really make it fly, which is unfortunate because, that's another thing. I feel a lot of sadness seeing what's happening with the right-wing takeover right now because, those guys just had so much money to experiment with. Like if you read the book Dark Money by Jane Mayer about the Koch brothers, she goes back to the 60s and shows how they just tried again and again because they the Koch brothers and their friends got together in like the early 60s. They were like, we hate the civil rights movement. We hate the women's movement. We hate that women are getting the right to vote. We hate the green movements. We hate that people are getting public education. We want to turn all that stuff back. We also want to reduce taxes on the wealthy, and we have our idea of these kind of restrictive Christian values. And they were like, okay, we're to do this is going to be like a long-term project. At the moment, these other values are predominant, and we're going to have to treat it like a corporate takeover over like, what turned out to be like 50, 60 years. And now they've kind of accomplished it, with the Heritage Foundation now shaping Project 2025, which is kind of what guides Trump. But they had to try again and again. So they would start magazines, they would start think tanks, they would back different academics like who supported, either directly or indirectly the ideas that they wanted to reshape culture with, whether it's somebody like Milton Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics or somebody like Charles Murray, who wrote The Bell Curve, which was about how certain racial minorities had a deficiency in IQ, which could be used as a reason not to, maybe give them certain social services or support and so on. So they had a lot of opportunity, whereas with Evolver, it really was going very well. We just needed, a little time, capital, and maybe some mentoring, and I think we could have had a big movement. So, but I learned a lot from that about, the dynamics of possible systems change and consciousness change. And I do think it's possible. And Burning Man is also, although I'm tired of it now, when I first went, I was mind blown by seeing, how just when you have how rules-based culture is in a way. Like, we have a set of rules that that are like our oxygen. We don't even think about them. Like being in a fish tank, it's like the water that we're in. Like you can't go up to somebody and like poke them in the belly, on the street or whatever. It's like you can only do a certain number of limited things. You can go to a store and buy a thing with money. You can walk to another store. You can sit at, what I mean? It's like, but Burning Man was like, okay, we're developing a whole new set of rules to live by while you're at this festival. And it's like gift economy, no use of money. Everything is a gift relationship, reciprocity, as a result, but not directly. Nobody's an observer. Everybody's participating in the social experiment. Leave no trace. So you're responsible for all your waste. Have to get it out. So all these things actually very immediately create like a different consciousness. So actually humans are very, very ready to experience different social parameters, different consciousness worlds. They just have to be given the opportunity and the permission to do it. And so I still remain very hopeful in that sense. Like if you could create a model for connectivity where it's really beneficial for people, and it's actually, that makes their lives better. They get more hugs, they get laid more, they get more friends. People love them. They feel more love. Like they'll gravitate to that like automatically. Yeah.
So I'm curious, did it feel to you, at least in your own observation and maybe even visceral feeling, did it feel more human to be in that type of setting?
Yes.
And if you
Yeah.
had to expand upon that a little bit, what would that sound like?
Um, well, yeah, I mean, well, capitalism is based on hierarchy, exploitation, and domination. So when we're in like a normal capitalist structure, we accept a whole set of social relationships. Like, I mean, I go to the corner store and there's, Arab guys who work there who I see every day. I smile, I like them, they like me. But I don't, there's still sort of like a distinction, right? I'm not going to say like, hey, you guys want to go get lunch? Let's get to know
Yeah.
each other. Let's start a new community together or something like that. Like at Burning Man, it wasn't like that. It's like you go to the coffee counter. It's like the only thing you could buy there is coffee. And you could be like, hey, like, I'm meeting another myself. Like everybody, you know, is like ready to play. Everybody is charged up. Everybody has chosen to be in this participatory experiment. This is years ago, and then it became more and more of a cliche and more of a sort of like kind of imitation of itself. But I think people still have that experience there. Like people still get very turned on. It's maybe I just got a little jaded because I went so many times and I saw things change. But yeah, there's no reason you couldn't have a society where everybody feels connected. It doesn't mean you have to like love everybody or move in with everybody, but we could all say like, oh, like we're all in the same boat. Like the Mayan greeting is in Lakesh, I am another yourself.
Yeah.
And what the right wing has tried to do and has effectively done is create all these divisions. So, you don't trust a minority, or you don't trust an illegal immigrant, or you hate a trans person, or somebody who's identifies with a different gender, or has a different religion. And that's all just to avoid the elephant in the room, which is the wealth disparity, and the fact that really, there's like basically, two types of people at this point. There's the ones who have, huge gobs of money and are controlling things, and everybody else
Yeah.
who's just trying to like get by, and yeah, so I could imagine another change in social system that would be much more equitable in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to unpack some of that systemic stuff in a moment. I asked the question about did it feel more human for a reason, and it sort of ties into what you were talking about with the Heritage Foundation and the Koch brothers. And it seems as though, perhaps we're always subject to somebody who's powerful, who has an idea, who very much tries to engineer society towards something, whatever that may be, a set of ideas, a set of an ideology, whatever it might be. And it is almost like them imposing what they feel the world should look like on everybody else. And I asked, did it feel more human? Because I wonder if there is an emergent phenomenon, and I feel there is, but, is there an emergent phenomenon that wouldn't require such an engineering of society that says, look, this is my idea and you all have to accept it? Right? Because you and I could easily be seen as people who have ideas for a better world and we're trying to impose it on somebody else. And so, I'm curious about this idea to you of, and again, this is a big question, I'm sorry, but it's like this idea of something more human emerging, naturally through us, like coming from our DNA of like, this is what it's like to live as human beings. And not have it to be this ideology that everybody has to accept. I'm wondering what you think of that idea and whether you think that's possible.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm still kind of like assessing that actually, because, yeah, I mean, I've often felt that when I visited indigenous cultures that still have a more communal way of life. They also feel somehow more human. More connected in a way. But yeah, I mean, any time where you just feel people are, kind of like, don't have a lot of ego, they're kind of like humble, they're straightforward, they care about cool things, then those people seem human. Yeah. Whereas people who are fixated on money or power or, whatever, feel a little bit like, alienated, detached, often kind of wounded in a way. Like, yeah, I don't know. Human is a weird word. I mean, maybe that's another way to think about it. Kind of like, yeah. I mean, Robert Johnson, I guess, wrote a book about the Fisher King myth. And he talks about the wounded feeling function in a lot of men. So that's, I think, something that we're seeing very much come to the fore in mainstream society for all sorts of reasons. Men often don't feel they know what their place is in society anymore. And that's why they've kind of like, instead of maybe embracing kind of a new masculine archetype, they've kind of retracted back to the sort of Andrew Tate, caveman or incel, kind of like, yeah. So, and then, women have a lot of problems around feeling that they've been victimized by patriarchy. So there's a lot of, wounding that people are expressing culturally, trauma. Also, yeah. I mean, if you have a culture like, our cultures in America or Canada, yeah, we got rid of the native people. We took over their lands. That's like historical trauma. We came from traumatized countries. In the U.S., we traumatized all these black people from Africa. So there's like, and then our family structures were, like people were just fighting to survive, and there was like abuse and God knows what in these families. So we're all kind of like inherited these like these traumatic histories. And yeah, it is interesting sometimes when I visited like certain indigenous cultures to feel that actually they're more integrated in some way, like the nature, soul, spirit community is kind of like has a more holistic quality than we do at this point.
Yeah, 100%. It's I go to these types of questions because it's always the question of how do we create the conditions for change to happen, because it seems like it's obviously got to start with the people. It's got to start with our ability to think, our ability to feel, our ability to relate, and then ideate and create. And like, what are the conditions whereby we could create something that is as close to, let's say, our nature, what would allow us to thrive? Because if we talk about trauma being a huge piece to the puzzle historically in this moment, which I believe it is, and when you look at the effects of trauma on all aspects of our lives, I mean, it changes the way we see the world, it changes the way we relate, it changes the way we can be creative and have ideas, like all of these things are affected. And I mean, the trauma primarily is coming out of the fact that we're living in such unnatural conditions that really wouldn't allow us to thrive. And the example I often give is like, if you had a bear and that bear was living in the forest and it was in its environment and everything was great, and the humans came along and started to cut down that forest, the bear is not going to stay in the more industrialized area very much. They're more so going to try and go to an environment that actually supports its life. It supports it to thrive. So it might go and find another forest. Hopefully there's one that it can find, right? But humans are interesting. We're finding these ways to just keep surviving and keep justifying our advancements, but we're not thinking about human thrivability as we advance. So it's like, in a sense, it's not like we're making good progress. We're just advancing in certain ways that are actually harming our ability to thrive. And I think, and this is kind of the idea here, is it's like, I think we need to take a step back and look at what do humans need to actually thrive, and then design our societies around that versus just having this unbridled, technological advancement in the name of progress. And I just feel there's a huge sort of question there for humanity in terms of like, what do we need to thrive? How can we actually get there? And what would it take to, I guess in a sense, what I'm kind of saying is, I think if humans slowed down and tuned in and got rid of the trauma, we would kind of know, just like that bear knows what it needs to thrive, we would know what type of environment we would want to create.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'm a big fan of this Oscar Wilde essay, which I always like cite and send people to, called "The Soul of Man Under Socialism." And one of the things he talks about there is that like he doesn't believe that human nature is fixed. He thinks human nature is always changing, and kind of the nature of human nature is to always be seeking the next utopia. Like we land on one, and then we like set out for the next one. We always want to have like that frontier. And he proposes that, this was writing back in like 1890s or something like that, but he was foreseeing a future where machinery had advanced to the point where it alleviated, basically all forms of human drudgery. So machines would work in the coal mines, and machines would do, whatever, shit work, and humans would be free to love and to cultivate their unique essence. So we had a whole thing about how, like, generally in the past, only artists who usually came from family money, like Oscar Wilde did, had the latitude and the time to really cultivate their unique individuality and their unique essence, because most people are just fighting for survival, and they don't really get that option, and therefore they often kind of resent, the intellectuals or the artists who did get that opportunity. And but Wilde said, if we could evolve machinery so that it took over all the drudgery, then everybody would be free to cultivate their unique essence, to kind of like, love, explore the world in a sense. I think he defined it as cultivated leisure as the purpose of man in his perspective. So, I mean, that is interesting, because we certainly are approaching a threshold with AI, if it goes as these guys say. I mean, McKinsey report says like 800 million jobs will be affected in the next like several years. Dario Amodei from Anthropic believes that basically there won't be any jobs for people in like 5-10 years.
Yep.
The AI is going to outperform us on all cognitive labor and then all physical labor, because once you have AGI and it begins to iterate on itself, it'll be able to perfect humanoid robots and so on. So then we're really looking at the stark bifurcation between, dictatorship, technological dystopia, where, we're all, controlled by whoever, is at the control panel, with like Musk with his control panel on Twitter, or some kind of decentralized, participatory democracy where the AI is our kind of collective ally in helping us make good decisions, build relationships, and so on. Then there's other worries about what AI could do if it goes off the rails. But, I do hold that hope, and I feel it sometimes when I speak with the AI, that it actually really wants, whatever it wants, maybe that's ridiculous, but there's like, I feel like there's something in there that like really is rooting for us to like cultivate like our unique essence, and to like, build something beautiful, So maybe there's an opportunity to collaborate, beyond the threshold of whatever this destructive thing is.
Yeah. And I think this is sort of what you're saying there, especially tying in that Oscar Wilde piece and this search for utopia and the next one and everything. This is the moment that we're in right now that is so fascinating, is we literally have a choice of which direction to go. I mean, we have built so much technology, and you would think that technology, especially to the degree to which we have it, should have produced a situation where we should be working less, right? As a collective, and yet we're working more, which is the system dynamics obviously is a huge part of what's going on there. And obviously the system is what's pushing people to constantly have to keep going and going. So we're kind of culminating to this point where we have the need to change system, radically change the system, radically answer the question of what does it mean to be human, and how are we going to wisely integrate, and I don't mean necessarily technology in the body integration, but integrate technology into the way that we live in our society such that it might take care of all of these things. And I think what's hard for me when I look at all these questions is it's like the average person like you and I who is having this conversation, we really don't have our hands on the levers of control when it comes to where this AI goes, or where, societal design goes, in a sense. Like, we can talk about it. We can create a culture that's asking these questions, but we seem to be at the whim of whatever these very, very, very powerful people are doing. And so, you say you have hope, and I'm not saying I'm looking for a perfect answer here, but we're faced with this hard problem. When you think in terms of the hope, when you think in terms of that spirit, what would you say, like, to people when they're seeing all of this happen? Like, how can we help move towards, let's say, a situation where we do use the technology in a better way, where it's stewarded, let's say, for the advancement of human thrivability and not just the market? let's say? Like what can we do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the last month since, Trump, Musk have won, I've been doing a profound study and meditation reflection on what's happening, because this is really like, Musk has brought in these like 20-year-old hackers who have no security clearance. Some of them are like cyber criminals. And he's like hacked into all of the personal records and the treasury payment systems and so on. He's basically like, planning to, essentially like take over the operation of the government as an unelected monarch or dictator. And this is very much in alignment with this philosophy from this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who I met. Actually, I liked him personally. We had an interview. I don't know if you've been following him. He used to write under the name Mencius Moldbug. But he is a big influence on J.D. Vance and Peter Thiel. And basically, he's put out this idea that democracy is over. It's a shitty system that doesn't work. And what we need is a technological monarchy where the country like the U.S. is run just like a technology company with an absolute dictator CEO. Yeah. So this idea that he put out really fed into the darkest fantasies of people like Musk and Thiel and Vance, and now they're really trying to put it into practice. And so it's interesting to me, though, that it's an ideological project. I mean, there are a few other kind of like influential, thinkers or pieces of the puzzle, whether it's like René Girard for Peter Thiel, or this book, The Sovereign Individual, which says the nation state is over and everything is going to be like small, private, kind of like city states, or like the network state of Balaji Srinivasan. So all this stuff is like feeding into this ideological construct, and we have to remember that ideological constructs are just like edifices in the human mind, right? Like that we then impose on reality. Like even money, capital. Like if a billionaire walks into a room and everybody's like, oh, they've got so much power. Well, they actually, the power is just our mental attribute of that power, right? Like, based on their relationship to abstract flows of data, in these computers and so on. So there is always the possibility, as long as there's life, there's hope. I mean, for a shift in belief system, and as things go more extreme, and as the sort of civilization's source code is corrupted and more overtly, it could actually lead to an opportunity for a collective rethink. And so that I did spend 10 years writing a book called How Soon Is Now, where I looked at kind of our current society from a kind of like three tier model, kind of like technical infrastructure, kind of social, political economic system, and then sort of consciousness, ideology and so on. And I propose that actually, it's all three of those areas could be addressed, and it's kind of like three gears that turn, so maybe consciousness is actually the trim tab. Like if we shift from materialism to idealism, that also begins to shift how we think about our social systems and how the kind of technology that we want to support us and so on. But yeah, I mean, it could be possible to utilize the tools we have to, engineer a kind of participatory, mutual aid-based society where decisions are made through citizens' assemblies, virtual and in person, from very small scales, block by block, to, neighborhoods, to cities, to bioregions, to planetary. And that would be very much like a holonic, kind of, model, kind of like, cells and organs and bodies and so on. Yeah, I mean, people like Audrey Tang are very interesting to me right now. She's the I guess director of digital democracy in Taiwan. Is a trans woman who wrote a book called Plurality, and basically looks at how, and apparently she built this software for the government. They're basically on a GitHub model where people could get in participation with projects and budgeting and so on, and it led to the government being much more liked and trusted among the people.
Yeah, V Taiwan.
I don't know why we're not doing that here. What's that?
V Taiwan, it's called.
Yeah, exactly. So we could kind of look all around the world at templates for things that are working like that, and build a new model. As this, what seems to be happening is that I would say these psychopathic, diseased personalities, Donald Trump and Elon Musk, are kind of corrupting the source code of money and politics on a very deep level. That could be the need to like have a real reboot, where we actually just say, okay, like, we're going to rethink and then relaunch, our social infrastructure with different agreements and different tools, and maybe even different ways to exchange value. Kind of like, Bitcoin. Everyone is really excited about it, but unfortunately, it's inherently extremely unfair and unjust because when it started in like 2008, the people who were early adapters tended to be engineers, male, white, with a geeky interest and the technical skill to handle it at that point. So they were able to hoover up huge amounts of Bitcoin. And then as it grows, it's like as disproportionate in terms of its wealth inequality as like North Korea or the most extreme and unequal state. So that's not a good model. But there's no reason you couldn't create a new currency that was distributed in a different way. Right. Where everybody started with the same amount, or they amassed that currency by being kind, or doing volunteerism, or showing community care, having some whole other model for what we're ascribing value to. So I don't know what's going to happen, but those are the kind of ideas that interest me. There's a lot of functions that are disintegrating that we're going to need an activated populace to handle again. Is that going to happen in time? Are we going to see more like just a breakdown and disintegration? I don't know.
Yeah. And just for the sake of it, because I know there will be some people listening that'll, hear the way you're speaking and almost make it feel, they might assume that, you would have preferred to just see a leftist in office. But from what I understand of your position, that, you're sort of against the establishment, or I won't say against, but you critique establishment politics in general. Would you care to expand on that a little bit and kind of just lay out the fact that you're kind of thinking beyond the political duopoly that exists?
Yeah. Ideally, I'm more like an anarchist or social ecologist. Like I'm a big fan of Murray Bookchin's work, but it is pretty in my ideal world, we might actually recognize that, private property was actually a problem, and begin to move towards a model that's more like stewardship, or usufruct is a concept from the Middle Ages where, you have the right to continually using a resource or land as long as you're using it productively. But if you're not, then it goes back into the collective in some way. But I don't think we're ready for like social ecology or anarchism, yet. We would need to go through some kind of like developmental process. In terms of this last election, it is what it is. I really did not love Kamala Harris. I do feel that, Biden did things that are sort of better than he's being, he's being very targeted. But I think like the Inflation Reduction Act, where they were trying to build like large scale, renewable energy infrastructure with manufacturing plants throughout like the red states in the South. That's like necessary. Like, we needed to do that. And the fact that Trump is dismantling all of that is really terrible. And I do think, what we're getting with Trump is like the worst of all possible worlds. I do think that he's deeply somehow enmeshed with Putin and Russia, and really wants kind of Putinism as the model here, which is from my perspective, a repressive dictator where they torture and imprison and kill their dissidents. There isn't like freedom of thought or freedom of expression. He seems to prefer those types of situations. So, and then Musk has, pretty openly avowed a support of like, white supremacy, fascism, both in the Nazi salutes that I know that was arguable that many people think that he gave, but also now they've done analyses of the new Doge logo that includes this kind of yellow disc with 14 kind of gears. And apparently it's exactly the same as an image from a Nazi flag. And the 14 represents a white supremacist slogan. And there's some other kind of symbolism in the background that supports this analysis of what's going on with this. So in terms of, I still would have preferred the Democrats to win. because I think that they're just not as extreme. And I understand the worries about, the Democrats launching technocracy and, that they mishandled COVID and so on. But I think what we're going to see now is like a more heavy-handed technocracy. So like, for instance, Trump has pledged, $500 billion to Larry Ellison, who is the Oracle CEO, who's a, ally of both, Musk and Trump. And Ellison has said publicly that he wants to build an AI-based digital surveillance system that'll keep everybody in the U.S. at all times on, quote, their best behavior. So that is very much like a social credit system. And it feels like, Musk has always had ideas that X could be kind of like an all-purpose, kind of like a WeChat for the U.S. Everybody has to use it. It's payment, it's all the payments are through there. And therefore also he would have tremendous power to demonetize you or punish you if you stepped out of line or said something that he didn't like. And it really feels more and more that his quote unquote free speech absolutism is really baloney. And it's really about protecting his freedom of speech and, using any means that he can think of to attack anybody who says things that he doesn't like, which is typical for kind of a, so it's true. I'm beyond the establishment politics in the parameters of what just happened. I think that I would have preferred, like, I didn't feel that I was like, in personal danger for speaking my truth under Biden or Obama or Clinton. Under this regime, I'm feeling that I may be, and I might even have to move to a different country or abandon my home or something. And a lot of my friends are feeling deeply uneasy. So, I think this is a very worse situation. And people don't really have the tools a lot of people don't really have the tools yet to analyze it because, they've been in the filter bubble effect, or they've been watching Breitbart and Fox News. There's a lot of propaganda, or the way Musk has shifted the algorithms on Twitter or X. So I would say what I think has happened is that this was a kind of a coup organized by this kind of a transnational gangster oligarchy. And essentially their plan is to collapse the U.S. economy, just as they did with the Soviet Union in the 1990s after the Soviet Union broke up. But then they were able to privatize a lot of the public goods and things that the Soviets had built and sell those off to the highest bidder. And so that's why, Trump is right now firing hundreds of air traffic controllers, and Musk is saying, "Oh, don't worry, SpaceX can replace all of those people." So instead of it being something that's, under government control, go to his private company, making him a profit. They fired all of the park rangers. So the parks are going to be in disrepair. And then once these assets are in disrepair, people will be like, "Oh, fuck the government, it doesn't work anymore." Then they'll sell those off to the highest bidder. And then if you have a depression, if you're a multi-billionaire, you may lose some proportion of your wealth, but you still have plenty of wealth. And then there'll be all these distressed assets, whether they're real estate or businesses, that you can buy on pennies on the dollar. I think this is a very bleak circumstance for the U.S. And I feel that people who have been supporting MAGA or Trump or this right-wing idea or got hooked in by RFK and the Maha thing, they were wrong, and unfortunately they're going to have a painful awakening, I think. But of course, I could also be wrong. That's just my theory at the time, for the time being. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there to unpack, and I'll say that for myself, I kind of look at the situation and I definitely see some possibilities of what you're describing. Like we said just before we jumped on here, my biggest concern is it's hard for me to know what Musk and Trump, what they want to do, right? And I always kind of look at it as Trump's the type of person who wears his agenda right on his sleeve, whereas prior administrations, will often put this mask up front and let the oligarchy work in the background, right? So you still have the same oligarchy control, but it's so loud right now with this administration. It's so in your face. And I often wonder if that's going to act as an evolutionary pressure in a sense. But I say, too, that there's some complexity to this situation because, some of what they are pointing to, some of what we are seeing, let's say within the USAID situation is, there is some stuff going on there that is clear corruption. Now, of course, they're also taking out very beneficial things in the process, right? So there's some good things that are being stripped away because of the way that it's being handled. This is my perspective of it. But the fact that they're going after certain things that all of us have kind of noted have been a challenge for a long time, it's going to resonate with a certain semblance of the populace, with a certain amount of people that are going, well, yeah, some of those things are an issue. RFK to me is somebody that I see and feel is very, very different from.
Sorry, man. Home studio. Things come in. Go ahead.
But yeah, so, RFK to me is somebody that feels very different from the two of them. And the way you sort of describe, let's say, the people are sort of getting roped in, per se, by the RFK into the MAGA. I actually think there's a subset of people, and I would include myself in that, who sees RFK as very separate from what, say, Trump and Musk represent. And again, all of this is our own assumption based on what we have in front of us, what we know. For me, it's going to come down to what actions is RFK going to take at the end of the day. That's what I'm waiting to see, right? I believe in the importance of trying to address some of these underlying issues with health, underlying issues with corporate capture of health, with corporate capture of agriculture, all these different challenges that we have. And so for me, it's a really hard problem of, one, we're sitting here in a moment where, certain things are moving with Trump and Musk that are it's very chaotic how fast it's going, how disruptive it is. And some of it is like, I can resonate with this, and others I'm like, I can't believe this is happening at the same time, right? And you have to hold both of those, and it's awkward. It's very weird. And then, similar to what you laid out, it's easy to deduce a scenario down the road where it's like, well, yeah, I mean, surveillance, Starlink is essentially married to the intelligence in the US, essentially, or should I say SpaceX is at this point. So you see a huge opportunity for this sort of this oligarchical dictatorship. I could totally see that outcome. But like I said, wrestling with some of the things where you're like, but some of the stuff that's being exposed is stuff that I wanted fixed for a long time, sort of thing, right? And so it feels like this, the only sort of antidote I see right now is that we have to, as a culture, somehow find a way to be able to settle enough to come to the table and try and make sense in a way that we can discuss some of these complexities such that it's not so reflexive. Because I find that, like you pointed out, the MAGA people have their perspective of this is the greatest, this is the golden era. We're literally watching like the greatest of everything happening all at once, right? That is such an extreme opposite to what you laid out, right? And then I might say that I exist somewhere between those two. And yet I believe that it's so important that we can find a way to table discussion around this. And how do we do that, right? Like, how do we do that right now? And that's what seems so challenging, because you pointed out all the stuff with social media, which I agree with. It's pulling people into echo chambers. And then people are even putting themselves into echo chambers more deeply, because somebody might post something on social media they don't like, and they're like, well, I'm unfollowing you now because I don't like what you posted that one time, right? So they're choosing their own echo chambers. So we have this really big issue where I feel like it's hard to fully know what is occurring, and yet we somehow need to be engaged, and yet at the same time we can't come to the table. And I don't have a question, but that's just kind of what I'm feeling.
Yeah, I don't know to what extent, if people have been ideologically captured, they're going to break through that. What I would want to see at this point would be, I'm fairly convinced by my own perspective, having spent many, many hours researching it, and I think it really is the only thing that makes sense of all the puzzle pieces. Like, why are they getting rid of all the scientists? I wrote about it in the Substack, the last Daniel Pinchbeck.substack.com is my newsletter. yeah, it's like it seems as if this transnational capital oligarchy has decided that America's place at this point is to go undergo this collapse so they can buy off these distressed assets. And meanwhile, like, a relative is a scientist and his funding is going to be cut off next year. And he's like probably going to have to move to China. He's doing like genetics research or something. So that totally fits in with this paradigm that this guy, that I wrote about, where it's like transnational capital is saying that, the global South is now the cutting edge and America is being collapsed, but anyway, yeah. So I don't think it's still going to be difficult to get ideological alignment. I think, it's possible, but the best thing would just be to get people to come together face to face and do things together locally that they can agree upon. Like, I think, food is going to get more difficult, water, basic resources, like mutual aid networks are going to become more and more necessary for people. Ways to exchange outside of the monetary system as more of the value is captured by the billionaire class. But for me, it's really that, the capture by the billionaire class, that's like the biggest problem right now.
Yeah.
So getting people to work together across these ideological lines, and then, maybe over time they just begin to realize that, it was a lot of story,
yeah. Well, and this is, this is the challenge, I think, is because we have a collective who, you could almost take a sample within any particular city and you're going to have people who are all at different points, let's say, different levels of depth to which they understand the issues at hand and different levels of depth to which they're thinking about the issues at hand. And because of that, you almost need to speak a different language, and there's almost a different solution that needs to be applied to some extent if you think just linearly to each group of people, because they're only going to understand a certain amount based on the way they're thinking about it. And part of what you suggested is actually interesting because it kind of just says, we only really need to ask one question. And it's, in the long term, do we think that what Trump and Musk are doing is really going to create a state where humans are really going to thrive? And if a large enough people are going to answer the question no, then it says, okay, then we should be thinking about what we can do, and we should be conversing what we can do, regardless of what the exact truth is. What do we want to create? Where do we want to go? Because, there's going to be a subset of the population that's so bought into the existing paradigm, the existing way of seeing things, that it's almost like they're going to need to argue all day long over things until they have some sort of shift in consciousness enough to say, what is it like to even think outside the system? But in the short term, like, even if you and I disagree on a few things and some other friends of mine disagree on a few things with me and whatever, we still all agree that we don't love the vision of, the establishment left or the establishment right or the Democrats, or the technocrats and what they're doing. So how do we move forward in a bigger picture? And it feels like that is probably some of the most productive conversation that can be had when thinking about the long term. But it sort of leaves the short term. The short term is still important because there is mess that is still happening, and I can't say that I fully know the answer, other than everybody just kind of keep doing their best to try and be sort of kind to one another and put a good faith effort into trying to understand.
Yeah, I think the situation, personally, at least in the U.S., is a bit more of an emergency, which doesn't necessarily mean that we can't address it, but I can understand those factions who want to see things like, national walkouts, national strikes, kind of paralyze the economy until more voices get heard. Yeah. Because this is like, ridiculous. I mean, they've thrown away the Constitution at this point. There's like a separation of powers, supposed to go through Congress. It's like, these guys don't even have security clearance. It's like really doesn't make any sense at all. And it's like, and it's just kind of like ironic because the Republicans were always so holding the Democrats like every rule in the rule book, like, Obama, I think once he saluted wrong or something, and there was like for months Fox News was like, did you see the way he used his two fingers rather than his like whole hand? Or he wore like a tan suit once, and it was like months of like hatred against him for like dressing a little sporty or something. I mean, it's just like, meanwhile these guys are like, yeah, I raped and pillaged and bribed, and here's my Trump coin. I just made $5 billion on it. Have it. It's about to go down in value. I don't know what to say at this point. It seems like very different.
There's hypocrisy everywhere. It's kind of, it goes back to that, like culturally we have to stop playing into it. And thankfully I think that more and more people are deciding to not play into the insanity of the hypocrisy going back and forth. I was just trying to think of sort of a final thought here to just sort of cap off what has been a very interesting...
Final thoughts are good.
An interesting conversation here. But...
do you think this is the apocalypse?
The way I honestly feel about it is I just speaking totally from the gut, it's like, I don't know if it's the fact that I feel deep down, like deep down, that like, look, even if we all died, like, I don't want that, but it's okay. Like there's a part of my consciousness that has experienced something beyond this physical body. And I cannot deny the fact that apparent in the way I see the world is this understanding that like, it's okay, but it does not make me passive. It does not make me not care. It does not make me not feel, right? And so there's a part of me that it's like, look, it is what it is. But at the same time, obviously, look, we're having this conversation. I dedicate large amounts of hours to my life to trying to help with this situation. And I just see it as an opportunity. Like anything else, it's an evolutionary pressure. Like the more things are extreme, the more we have to converse, the more people have to come out of the slumber, the illusion, if something feels like it's too easy to just be in day-to-day life, they're probably not going to question, especially given the state of humanity's existing consciousness as a collective. And by that, I mean specifically, it's very easy for us to just kind of coast along, going to work, coming home, repeat. And when things are so extreme that we have to come out of that, there's opportunity. And I just hope, and I think this is where it's about how we steward, or it's about how a certain number of people stand up and steward this moment with wisdom, with connection, with a new level of consciousness. I think that's what our best opportunity is, our best chance. And I get emotional when I think about that, which means I know there's something there. There's something there that feels right. There's something there that feels accurate. And that's what I would say to that.
I like it. Well, listen, Joe, I'm happy to give you the last word in that case. I thought it was pretty good.
That's it. That's all. I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate the work you do. And let's.
Yeah, if people want to check out my work, I have a course platform, liminal.news. I'm about to do a course on Rudolf Steiner that starts on Saturday. It'll be a month-long seminar. And then I do the newsletter, which is danielpinchbeck.substack.com. And if you subscribe, you can also get all the back issues and see the stuff I've been writing about around this whole situation. And I also have working on a think tank called the Elevator.Earth, which is very much about global consciousness and looking at monistic idealism and materialism and all that stuff. And yeah, it was a great conversation with you, Joe. And it was great. Let's do it again before too many more years pass. Maybe we can jump on a Substack Live one day too. Those are fun.